Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Ramanaya. Welcome to the 126th Advaita Arunachala celebrations of Shri Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi. I am Mohan Ramaswamy from Arunachala Ashram, New York. Good morning to all of you on the eastern side of the United States. Now, we are going to start this satsang program from the United Kingdom. Michael James, please.
Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya. Namaskaram. Today, the subject I want to talk about is Bhagavan Ramana, the flower of Vedanta. When I say the flower of Vedanta, what I mean is he is the full blossoming of Vedanta. I could equally call him, say, the cream of Vedanta, or the crestule of Vedanta. He is all those things, and he is also the source of Vedanta. He's the ultimate source from which all Vedanta comes. So this is what I would like to talk about today. To put this in context, we need to first understand the place of Vedanta in the broader family of Indic religions. That is Jainism, Buddhism, what is nowadays called Hinduism, Sikhism. These are all one family of religions. There is so much they share in common. The basic ideas of karma, dharma, samsara, this endless cycle of birth and death, and moksha, freedom from this cycle. And there's so many commonalities between all these. There are, of course, so many differences, so much variation. So there's a huge diversity, but with underlying commonalities. So these are all one family of religions. The first major divide among these religions is the divide between Astika and Nastika. Even these terms are differently interpreted in different contexts by different people, but generally, that is one of the definitions. Is the Astika schools of philosophy accept the Vedas as revealed knowledge, and the Nastika do not accept. But even those, the Jains and the Buddhists do not accept the Vedas in as revealed knowledge. But even they have so much in common with all the Astika philosophies. So all these various divisions and distinctions, they are very fluid and they're not set in stone. And undoubtedly Vedas influenced the development of Buddhism and Jainism. And Jainism and Buddhism has influenced the development of all the various forms of Hinduism. That is all the many different systems of philosophy that have flourished in India over thousands of years. Each, they were always interacting with each other, always feeding off each other, that is drawing inspiration from each other, influencing each other. In their arguing with each other, they were each leading to the growth of the other. So it's all one large family. The Astika philosophies, as I say, they all accept the authority of the Vedas. But even among them, there's so much diversity of interpretation of the Vedas. And the Vedas are generally themselves divided, particularly by Shankara. He divided into two broad sections, the Karma Kanda and the Jnana Kanda. The Jnana Kanda is Vedanta, the Upanishads. The Jnana Kanda is called Vedanta because it is the philosophical conclusion of the Vedas. That is all the karma portions ultimately lead to. The final conclusion of all of the Vedas is Vedanta. So Vedanta is the and nowadays when we talk about the Vedas, generally we're talking about Vedanta. That is the old ritualistic portions of the Vedas. Though Vedic rituals are still practiced, they are not practiced in the same way as they were in the past. That is the whole, the Astika family of, that is the subfamily of that we nowadays call Hinduism, has developed in so many ways over the centuries. But the Vedas nowadays, when we talk about the Vedic religion, we're generally talking about Vedanta. And among the Astika schools of philosophy, they're generally classified as 6. That is Nyaya, Vaiseshika, Sankhya, Yoga, and Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa. Uttara Mimamsa is another term for Vedanta. So these 6, but though these are 6 distinct systems of philosophy, each has contributed to the other. Each draws on the other. For example, Nyaya, the logic and the reasoning of the Nyaya system is used by all the other systems. So there's so much influence from all of these are influencing each other, but it all culminates in Vedanta. Vedanta is, though Vedanta draws on all these others, ultimately Vedanta is the pinnacle of the Vedas, and all these other systems contribute to Vedanta. So what nowadays we call Hinduism is to a large extent Vedanta. Of course, there are other systems. There's the various forms of Shaivism, for example, the Kashmir Shaivism, Shaiva Siddhanta in South India, which may not describe themselves as Vedanta, as part of Vedanta, but they are still strongly influenced by Vedanta. And of course, Shaivism has strongly influenced has such a strong influence in Vedanta. So it's all one large family, but it's all it's as if Vedanta is the crest jewel of this vast mountain. And the Buddhism and Jainism, they have also had, though they are distinct from Vedanta, they have been influenced by Vedanta, and Vedanta has been influenced by them. So it's all one large family. But the cream of this family, we can say, is Vedanta. And among Vedantins, there are so many different forms of Vedanta. There's the Advaita, which is Gaudapada and Shankara. There be the early representatives of the Advaita tradition. Then there's various forms of Beda Vedanta. There's Vishishta Advaita, there's Dvaita, there's Achintya Beda Vedanta, the Gaudiya school, so many different interpretations. All these different interpretations, one of the ways in which the distinction between Advaita and the other schools is Advaita focuses very much on Jnana. The other schools focus more on Bhakti. But Bhakti and truly speaking, Vedanta is both Bhakti and Jnana. I mean, we can't separate Bhakti from Jnana. Some Advaitins may have looked down on Bhakti or considered Jnana to be somehow superior. But if we see all the greatest Advaitins, Shankara, for example, he sang so many devotional hymns. And many of the later Advaitins, great Advaitins like Appaya Dikshita. He was a great Shaiva Bhakta and also a great Vedantin. And he was in South India. In North India, I think his name was Madhusadena Saraswati. He had written a commentary on the Gita in which he blended the Bhakti and Jnana. So truly speaking, to consider Advaita as distinct from Bhakti is a very limited view. But in Bhagavan's life, Bhagavan is the fullness of both Bhakti and Jnana. So Bhagavan, though philosophically, Bhagavan is very clearly an Advaitin, he that is why the other schools of Vedanta are so popular. Vishista Dvaita, Dvaita, Chintya Beda Vedanta, or the Gaudiya school. Why these are so popular? Because naturally Bhakti has a great appeal to people. It has an emotional appeal to people. That is, our nature is not. We are as human beings, or as any embodied being, we are a mixture of intellect and emotion. That is, both of them are important sides of our nature. So we cannot that is. We cannot separate, we cannot deny the importance of the emotional side or the intellectual side. Both are important. Of course, Bhakti and Jnana is more than just intellect and emotion. It's more than, I mean, Bhakti is much more than just emotion, and Jnana is much more than just intellect. But these two sides, they're two sides of our nature. In fact, even our real nature, Atma Swarupa. What is Atma Swarupa? It is Sat Chit Ananda. Chit is Jnana. It's also called Satyam Jnanam Anantam. Satyam means being, what is. Jnanam means the awareness, the knowledge, and Ananta means it's infinite. So Brahman is the fullness of Jnana, Prajnanam Brahman. That is, Brahman is the pure awareness, but Brahman is also the fullness of love. Another description of Brahman is Asti Bhati Priyam. Asti means being, Bhati means shining, that's the awareness, and Priyam, the love. So Brahman is both the fullness of love and the fullness of Jnana. So since that is according to Vedanta, Brahman is the one reality. So, and that one reality is the fullness of both Bhakti and Jnana, as we have seen exemplified in Bhagavan's lifetime, both in Bhagavan's life and in his teachings. That is, Bhagavan was his teachings about Advaita in the purest and of pure forms. That is, though there were so many, that is, the literature on the Advaita philosophy is vast, from the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutra, the Bhagavad Gita, the commentaries on these by Shankara, Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika, and so many later commentaries and other texts on this. So there's a vast literature on Advaita in Sanskrit and Tamil and so many other languages. So there's a vast amount of literature. A lot of it is very complicated, but Bhagavan has given us the simple essence of all of that. Is, if we take Advaita as the essence of all of Vedanta, Bhagavan's teachings are the essence of all of Advaita. Bhagavan presented Advaita in a very simple but extremely profound form, and he also highlighted the oneness of Bhakti and Jnana. Bhagavan often used to say there are two ways: so investigate yourself or surrender yourself. But though he sometimes spoke of it as if it was two ways, he also made it very clear that ultimately we can surrender ourselves only by knowing what we actually are. That is, what is when we say Atma Samapanam, what is the Atma but we have to surrender? Yeah, that is ego. Ego is a false awareness of ourselves. So how can we surrender this false awareness of ourselves except by being aware of ourselves as we actually are? So it is only by investigating ourselves, but we can begin surrendering ourselves before coming to this path of jnana. We begin by trying to surrender our will to the will of God. But ultimately, we cannot surrender our will fully without surrendering the one whose will it is. Whose will is it? It's ego's will. So we need to surrender ego. And we can surrender ego completely only by turning within and holding on to our own reality and thereby merging back into our source. That is why Bhagavan says in the first sentence of the 13th paragraph of Jnana, Anma Chintane Tavira, Vera Chintane Kalamba Vadaku, Satram Idum Kodamal, Apmanishta Paranai Iripte, Tanne Isanaku Alipadam. That means Atma Chintana Tavira. That means accept Atma Chintana. Atma Chintana literally means thought of oneself. It implies self-contemplation or self-attentiveness. In other words, it's another term for Atma Vichara. So accept self-attentiveness, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any other thoughts, thereby being Atmanishta Paran. Atmanishta Paran means one who is firmly established as oneself, one who abides as oneself. That is giving oneself to God. So actually, I read the sentence in the order in which it's presented in Tamil, but in English we would say it the other way around, because the main clause is Atmanishta Paranai Iripade, that being one who is firmly established as oneself, alone is giving oneself to God. And then the first part of the sentence is an adverbial clause explaining how can we be Atmanishta Paran? Only by being so keenly self-attentive, by clinging so firmly to Atma Chintana, but we give no room to rising of any other Chintana. So there Bhagavan is clearly implying that surrender, the final surrender can be achieved only by means of self-investigation. So Bhagavan shows how Bhakti and Jnana merge together and become one. So though Bhagavan talked about two paths, Atma Vichara, self-investigation, and Atma Samapanam, self-surrender, truly speaking, these two are one. We cannot even begin to investigate ourselves without thereby surrendering ourselves. That is, to the extent to which we are turning our attention within, ego is thereby subsiding. The subsidence of ego is self-surrender. So in so many ways, Bhagavan highlighted the oneness of Bhakti and Jnana. Returning to what I was talking about before, one other point I wanted to talk about was when I was talking about Vedanta in the broader context of the Indic family of religions. Vedanta, as there's a beautiful verse in Aksharammalai in which Bhagavan, what Bhagavan says in verse 99 of Aksharammalai, Bhagavan sings, Vedantate Verera Vilangum Veda Porol Arunachala. This is a prayer. What Bhagavan is praying in this verse is Arunachala. Arul means, here he's using Arul as a verb. So Arul means graciously give. Veda Porol. Porol is a word for which we have no adequate equivalent in English. That is, the basic meaning of Porol is the substance. But it also, Porol means very much, is a Tamil word, but means very much the same as Vastu in Sanskrit. So it's the substance, the reality. But Porol also means the meaning or the import. So give me the Veda Porol, the substance or the import of Vedanta, Verara Bilangam, which shines without another, Vedantate in Vedanta. So the meaning of the verse is, if we just take the bare meaning, Arunachala graciously give the substance of the Vedas, which shines without another in Vedanta. If we slightly if we slightly paraphrase that to bring out the the implied meaning, what Bhagavan is praying here is Arunachala, by revealing it in my heart as my own real nature, graciously give me the substance or import of Vedanta. In other words, the reality to which the substance or import of the Vedas, in other words, the reality to which the Vedas ultimately point, namely Brahman, the nature of which is pure awareness, I am, which, as declared in Vedanta, shines without another. That is, shines without anything other than itself. That is, in the Upanishads, it is Brahman is described as ekam eva advaitiyam. Ekam means one, eva means only, advaitiyam means without a second. So one only without a second. That is what Bhagavan is alluding to here when he says Verara Vilangam. So Bhagavan is clearly emphasizing here that the true import of Vedanta, or of the Vedas, is contained in Vedanta, and it shines without another. It is, in other words, it is Brahman. The ultimate import of the Vedas is only Brahman, and that shines without another as revealed in Vedanta. So Bhagavan, but Bhagavan here, this is a prayer. Bhagavan is praying for that. He's praying for, Arul means grace. That is, Arul is both a noun but means grace, and a verb that means graciously give me or bestow upon me or grant me. So this is here Bhagavan is emphasizing the ultimate aim is the experience of otherlessness. In other words, Advaita. Advaita Anubhava is what he's praying for here. But he's praying for it. It's only by the grace of Arunachala that we can get this. So Bhagavan, I will come back to this a little later, because before I come back to Aksharamaya, I first want to talk about Upadesa Undiyar, Upadesa Saram, and show how Bhagavan brings all the various different practices and different forms of spiritual practice, how he brings them to get all together and shows how they all lead ultimately to Jnana. That is, in Upadesa Undiyar, Bhagavan has spoken about all the four margas, that is often the spiritual path described as four separate paths. That is the path of karma, which in this context means Nishkamya Karma, the path of desireless action, the path of bhakti or devotion, the path of yoga, that means potentially it's yoga, Raja Yoga, as it's also sometimes called, and the path of Jnana. These are generally said to be the four paths. But unlike some who claim that each of these four paths is an independent means to our final goal, Bhagavan makes it clear in Upadesa Undiyar, all these lead indirectly to a final goal, but they take us to a final goal only by merging in Jnana. So that is what I'll now talk about for a little. That is, in Upadesa Undiyar, and Upadesa Saram, what Bhagavan in the first two verses, because of the context in which Bhagavan wrote Upadesa Undiyar, that is, Murugan was a genius. He found the perfect context to get to draw out these teachings from Bhagavan. When he was telling the story of the Dvarakapana rishis in his Tiruvundiya poem in Ramana Sandi Murai, that is in much of Sanadi Murai is closely following Tiruvasakam. In Tiruvasakam, there's a poem called Tiruvundiya, in which Manikavasaka talks about various Shiva Leelas. In Murugana's view, Bhagavan is all gods. All gods are only manifestations of Bhagavan. So in Murugana's Tiruvundiya, he tells the stories of various gods. In fact, there are two Tiruvundiya poems in Ramana Sandi Murai. There's a long one and a short one. The short one, the second one, is just some 5 or so verses. the first 2 or 3 of which talk about Buddha, and the last 2 of which talk about Jesus. And so basically he's saying it was Bhagavan in the form of Buddha who started the wheel of Dharma rolling. So it was, in other words, he's saying it's Bhagavan who appeared in the form of Buddha to give the Buddhist teachings. And it was Bhagavan in the form of Jesus who died on the cross to save us from our sins. So that's one Tiruvundiyar. But the main part, he's talking about various the various gods of Hinduism. Rama and Krishna and Subramanya and all these, so various divine leelas he's talking about, but he says it's Bhagavan in the form of all these various gods that did all these various leelas. So the last leela he talks about in the main Tiruvundiyar, in the large Tiruvundiyar, is the story of the Dvarakavana rishis. Though they were called rishis, they were actually karma kandis. They were following the Purva Mimamsa. And according to the Purva Mimamsa, as Murugan says in one of his in one of the earlier verses of when he's telling the story, he says but they became very proud, thinking karma te andri kadavalile, except karma there is no God. That is the philosophy of Purva Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsa puts the power of karma on such a pedestal, they think there's no need for any God. So Bhagavan selected that verse where we're going to say that as part of the Upadgatam, part of one of the introductory verses to Upadesa Undiyar. So in that context, what Bhagavan says in the first verse of Upadesa Undiyar is karmam payantaral kartana danayal, karmam kadavalo undipara, karmam jadamadal undipara. That is kartaragnya palam, karma kim param, karma tachadam in Sanskrit. So, but what this means is, I'll read the meaning of the Tamil version, action giving fruit is by the ordainment of God. Since action is non-aware, since action is jada, is action God? In other words, karma, when we do an action, that is, the action is done by us, but as soon as we've done the action, the fruit of the action is out of our hands. If we shoot an arrow, before we shoot the arrow, we can aim it in whatever direction we want. Once we've actually shot it, we have no control thereafter what its target will be. Likewise, when we do any action, we may do an action for a certain purpose, but once we've done the action, the fruit of that action is out of our hands. It's in the hands of God. So whatever action we do, that means whatever agamya we do, the fruit of that agamya is stored in Sanchita. And from Sanchita, God selects which fruit will be most favorable for us to experience when. And so what is the appropriate fruit for each karma, and when, where, and how we should experience that fruit, that's entirely in the hands of God. That's what Bhagavan means by karmam payandaro kartana danayal. It's in Sanskrit, kartaragnya prapyade palam. So the fruit are entirely in his hands. We are the doer of actions, but the fruit and when, where, which fruit is appropriate for which action is entirely in his hands. So, but in Purva Mimamsa, because they don't want to accept God, they say there is something called adrishta, something unseen, but decides what should be the fruit of the action. But according to Bhagavan, the fruit of the action is entirely in the hands of God. Then he asks, karmam kadavalo, can karma be God? Karmam kim param. Karmam jadamadal. Since in Tamil he says karmam jadamadal, since karma is jada. In Sanskrit he says karmam tat jadam. Karma is insentient. So since karma is insentient, karma cannot decide which fruit is appropriate for which action. It is only God who decides that. So Bhagavan is here repudiating the philosophy of the Purva Mimamsa. He's showing that karma is always subservient to God, that we do the karma, but God decides the fruit, and it is God who allots us the fruit in the form of our prarabdha. Then in the next verse, Vinayam Vilevu Vilevutru Vittai Vinay Kadal Vetidamundi Para Vidu Tarale Undi Para. That means the fruit of action perishing. That is, when we experience the fruit of any action, that fruit is finished. That is, if someone gives you a mango, you can't eat it today and keep it to eat tomorrow. Once you've eaten mango is finished. So likewise with the fruit of action, when the fruit of action is experienced, it's thereby finished. But though the fruit of action perishes, what remains is the seed. The seeds here means the vasanas. So as he then says, Vittai Vinay Kadal Vetiram, as seed causes to fall in the ocean of action. In the Sanskrit version, because Bhagavan wrote in a shorter meter, he doesn't mention the seed. So he leaves it there. In Sanskrit, he says in the first line, Kriti Mahodado Patana Karanam, the cause for falling in the vast ocean of action. What is the cause? He doesn't say. He leaves it for us to understand. But in the Tamil version, he makes it clear. It's the seeds. And what are the seeds? As he says in the Malayalam version, vasana kara vittai. That is the seeds in the form of vasanas. So it's the vasanas. That is, why do we do any action? We do action because we want to experience certain vishayas. So those inclinations to experience vishayas are what are called vishaya vasanas. And because the vishaya vasanas lead us to do actions, they're also called karma vasanas. So whether we call vishaya vasanas or karma vasanas, ultimately it's the same. So it's the vasanas that lead us to do action. And that is what causes us to fall in the great ocean of action. And then in Bhagavan, so Bhagavan concludes this verse in Tamil saying, Vidu Tarile, it does not give liberation. In Sanskrit, he says, Palamasaswatam, that is the translation of Vinayam Vilevutru, the fruit of action perishing. Palamasaswatam means the fruit is impermanent. That is, once you experience the fruit, it's finished. But then he says, Gati Nirodhakam. That is, because the seeds, the vasanas, causes to fall in the great ocean of action, action cannot give a liberation. Well, in Tamil, he says it cannot give liberation. In Sanskrit, he says even more forcibly, it obstructs liberation, nirodhakam. It's the obstacle to liberation. So how can we attain liberation? If action won't give us liberation, what can we do to attain liberation? Anything we do is only binding us all the more. So in verse 3, this is where the real spiritual teachings begin. In verse 3, what Bhagavan says is, Katanu kakam nishkarmya karmam, karate tirti aktundi para, gativari kambikum undi para. That means Nishkamya Karma is desireless action. That is action we do not for the sake of any, normally when we do any action, we do it for some purpose. All our actions are, as a general rule, driven by some aim. We do some action because we want to experience some result. So, but Nishkamya Karma is action done without any expectation of, without any desire for the results. We are doing the action. So how can we do action without any purpose? So Bhagavan says here, Katanu kakam, that is done for God. In the Malayalam version, he says, Ishwara Pritiyanai, that means done for the love of God. So it is, if we want to do Nishkamya Karma, we need to act just for the love of God, not for what we can get out of it, but just for the love of God. So here Bhagavan indicates, actually, though they talk about the karma marga, Nishkamya marga, as if it's a separate path. Actually, Bhagavan takes the Nishkamya karma marga as a part of bhakti. That is, bhakti begins with actions. So, because we without that love for God, how can we do Nishkamya karma? Any action has to have some motivation. So if it's not motivated by love of God, it's going to be motivated by desire for some result. So Bhagavan takes Nishkamya karma as a subsidiary part of the path of bhakti, as I'll explain in more detail. And he says, karati tirati, karate tirati. That means, or aktu karam, what is it? Yes, karate here means the mind, or the chittam. Tirati means purifying, or literally tirati means rectifying, but it implies purifying the mind, or purifying the chittam. In Sanskrit, he says chitta sodakam, ishwarapitam, nechaya kritam. What is offered to God, not done with desire, chitta sodakam, mind purifier, mukti sadakam, liberation accomplishing. In Sanskrit, he says mukti sadakam, but we have to understand it's not a direct means to liberation. In Tamil, he says it more clearly. He says it will show the way to liberation. What does this mean? That is, we cannot by any action attain liberation. But if we do the action just for the love of God, not for anything we can gain for it, that will purify the mind. And the purified mind will recognize the path to liberation. Can't become means. We can translate it as show, but it's actually a causative, the causative form of kan, which means to see. So it will cause to see. So it will enable us to see what is the path to liberation. So the path to liberation is not karma per se, because karma obstructs liberation, but by doing Nishkamya karma for the love of God, that will purify the mind, and in the purified mind, we will then recognize what is the path to liberation. So that's what Bhagavan is saying in the third verse. Then in the fourth verse, he begins to talk about the different forms of Nishkamya karma we can do. He says, Didamidu, this is certain. Puja Japamum Dhyanam Udal Vaku Ula Toril. Puja, Japa, and Dhyana are actions of body, speech, and mind. We have to understand respectively. That is, puja is an action of the body, japa is action of speech, and dhyana is action of mind. Weevu ahum ondril ondru. That literally means one than one is superior. What he means is, in this order, the more efficacious in purifying the mind than puja, japa. More efficacious than japa, dhyana. So in this order, each one is superior. When he says superior in this context, because the subject matter is that the aim of all these nishkamya karmas is the purification of the mind. So when he says it's superior, he means it's a more effective means to purify the mind. In the Sanskrit, he says, Kaya vanmana karyam uttamam pujanam japa chintanam kramat. That means worship, repetition, or puja, japa, and dhyana. Actions to be done by body, speech, and mind are progressively superior. And then in the next three verses, he talks about each of these. In verse 5, he gives us a very broad definition of puja. What he says is, Ennuru yabum irayuru amena enivari padal undipara isan nal pusane undipara. That means worshipping, thinking that all 8 forms are forms of God is good worship of God. The 8 forms here, this is a Shaiva concept, that is, Shiva is often referred to as Ashtamurti, and he's the one with 8 forms. And the 8 forms are said to be, different books give slightly different classification, but generally what is the 8 forms are the 5 elements: earth, water, fire, and space, and sun, moon, and sentient beings, jiva. So that's virtually the whole, that everything is included. Everything is made of the 5 elements. So worshipping anything, taking it to be a form of God, is good worship of God. So if you see a hungry person and you consider and you offer food to that person with the attitude that you're offering food to God, that is good worship of God, because it's God in the form of that person who has come to you with a need for food. Or if you see, nowadays we live in a world with so much environmental damage we see going on. So if we try to live an eco-friendly lifestyle, trying to avoid causing more damage to the environment, if we have the attitude that the whole world is God, all the elements are God, and so we are trying to avoid doing harm to the world because we consider the world to be God, that is good worship of God. So the Bhagavan doesn't limit puja just to the ritual puja. Of course, ritual puja is also a good form of worship, but Bhagavan gives us a very broad definition of worship. And then in verse 5, he talks about japa. He says, Varotil Vaku Vaikul Japatil Virupamam Manadum Undipara Vilumbam Dhyana Undipara. This is Bhagavan. Bhagavan this is a real sutra here, because Bhagavan packs so much into it. But the literal meaning of this is, rather than praising, loud voice, rather than japa within the mouth, what is done by mind is beneficial. This is called dhyana. That is what Bhagavan is here talking about. He's classifying different practices. That is, rather than praising, rather than singing stotras aloud, doing japa in a loud voice is good. Rather than japa in a loud voice, japa whispered softly within the mind is good. Rather than whispered softly within the mouth is good. Rather than the softly whispered japa, japa done by the mind is good. And that japa done by the mind, this is a form of dhyana. So in all these, he's grading this. When he says it's beneficial or superior, he means it's more effective in purifying the mind. Why is japa more effective than puja? Because the speech is a subtler instrument than the body. So the actions done by body are relatively gross. The actions done by speech are subtler. And the actions done by mind are still subtler. So they're more effective means to purify the mind. We can be doing puja mechanically, for example, without our mind can be wandering here and there. We can just be mechanically going through the actions of puja. But if we are meditating, if our mind wanders off, we immediately know our mind has wandered off because we're no longer thinking of God. And japa is somewhere in between these two. It's possible to just continue repeating the mantra mechanically without really thinking about what the mantra denotes. If we are, for example, if we are singing in our mind, Namo Ramanaya or Arunachala Shiva or Namah Shivaya or any mantra, it's very easy for us to allow our mind to wander off to other things. The tongue or the mind, in the background, the mantra will be going on, but the mind is still wandering. So that's why each one is superior to the previous one. And so rather than singing stotras in a loud voice, doing japa in a loud voice. That is, japa implies you're concentrating just on a few words. So that's more focus. And rather than doing it in a loud voice, whispering it softly within your mouth. And rather than whispering it softly in your mouth, doing it mentally. That is good. So but here Bhagavan isn't saying all practices are equal. Bhagavan is showing how each practice can lead on to the further practices and how each successive practice is superior to the previous one. And then in verse 7, he talks about dhyana. he says, Vittu Karutalin, Arune Vichipol, Vidadu Unnale Undipara, Visedamam Unnabe Undipara. That means rather than meditating interruptedly, meditating uninterruptedly, like a river or like the continuous flow of a river or the falling of ghee, is superior. It's a superior way to meditate. So that is, when we are meditating on God, if our mind keeps on wandering off elsewhere, that means we are more interested in other things than we are in God. So the more our love, the greater our love for God, the less our mind will wander away from. Because why does our mind wander away to other things? Because other things seem to be more interesting than thinking about God. But the more we have love for God, the more interrupted our meditation will be. That's why Bhagavan said the uninterrupted meditation is superior to the meditation done interruptedly. Because the key to all these, remember, Bhagavan said in verse 3, done for God. That implies done for the love of God. So the key to all these practices, that is Bhagavan in these, when Bhagavan talks about Puja, Japa, and Dhyana, he's not talking about Kamya Puja, Japa, and Dhyana. People do Puja for gaining some result. They do Japa for expecting some result, or meditation expecting some result. If I meditate on God, then God will bless me and he'll remove my difficulties and give me all I want. So long as we're doing that, that's not what Bhagavan's talking about here. Bhagavan is here talking about the Nishkamya Puja, Japa, and Dhyana. So because these are actions of mind, speech, and body, these preliminary practices of bhakti are the path of Nishkamya Karma. But after verse 7, Bhagavan switches from the karma to from doing to being. The switch is when that is, so long as we are taking God to be something other than ourselves, when we're meditating on him or doing puja to him or repeating his name, our attention is going out away from ourselves towards something else. That is, we're still taking God to be something other than ourselves. But is God other than ourselves? No, but I mean, so long as we rise as ego and seem to be this small person, then God seems to be something other than ourselves. But actually, God is that which is shining in our heart as I. Avanaham aham, he is I, soham. So what Bhagavan says in verse 8 is, rather than anya bhavatin avanaham aham ananya bhavame undipara anatinam uttamam undipara. Rather than the meditating on God as Anya, something other than ourselves, meditating on him as not other than ourselves, as Ananya. We're meditating on what is not other than ourselves is only ourselves. And why do we meditate on him as not other than ourselves? Because we recognize that he is that which shines in our heart as I, Avanaham. So with that understanding that God is shining in our heart as I, meditating on nothing other than I, that is anatinam uttamam. That is the best among all. That means it's the most effective means to purify the mind. It's the best practice of bhakti. Sorry, I see I'm running out of time a little, so I'll just try and speed up a bit. Then in verse 9, he says, Baba Balatinal Bhavanatita Sabhava Tirutale Undipara Parabhakti Tattva Mundipara. By the strength of that Bhava, that what he refers to here as Bhava is referring to what he referred to in the previous verse as the Ananya Bhava. In other words, the meditation on oneself. So in other words, by the strength of self-attentiveness, Bhavanatita Satbhava Tirutale, being in Satbhava. Satbhava means the state of being. So being in the state of being, by the strength of that self-attentiveness, and that state of being is Bhavanatita. It is beyond all bhavana. Bhavana here implies meditation as an action, as a mental activity. So if we are focusing so long as we're allowing our attention to go out towards anything else, even the name or form of God, that is a mental activity, because it's a movement of our attention away from ourselves towards God. When we turn our attention back within to see who am I, our attention is not moving, it is subsiding back into its source. So by the strength of self-attentiveness, we remain in the state of just being, the Sat Bhava, which is beyond all mental activity. And that, Bhagavan says, is Parabhakti Tattva. That is the nature or reality of supreme devotion. So here Bhagavan has shown how karma is a subsidiary part of bhakti, and bhakti leads to eventually to a path of jnana, the path of meditating on oneself alone, nothing other than oneself, and that is the parabhakti tattva. So in effect, what Bhagavan is saying here, being as we actually are, by the strength of self-attentiveness, is parabhakti tattva. So Bhagavan is showing that the path of self-investigation is the pinnacle of the path of bhakti. It's not something, it's not a separate path, it's what the path of bhakti is leading up to. Because when we attend to ourselves, ego is thereby subsiding. So that is surrender, that is giving ourselves to God, as he says in the first sentence of the 13th paragraph of Jnana that I referred to earlier. So that is the parabhakti tattva. That means the nature or reality or true state of supreme devotion. So according to, when Bhagavan teaches us the path of vichara, he's teaching us the ultimate practice of bhakti. And then in the next verse, verse 10, he summarizes everything. He says, that in verse 9, he referred to as being in our state of being. What he refers to there is being in Satbhava Tirutale, being in the state of being, is what he describes in verse 10 as Udita Idatil Odungi Iratal, being subsiding in the place from which we rise. That is being as we actually are by subsiding in the place from which we've risen. What is the place from which we've risen? The place from which we've risen is our real nature. That is, though he refers to it as a place, it's not literally, we shouldn't take place in a literal sense. That is, when ego rises, from where does it rise? It can only rise from our real nature. Because as he says in verse 26 of Uladunaptu, for example, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande undain, anatum undahum. Ahande indrel, intranatum. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Everything there means all objects, all phenomena. So if everything else comes from ego, from where can ego come? It cannot come from anything else. It can only come from the one thing that always exists, namely Atma Swarupa, our own real nature, Brahman. So Brahman is our Udita, is the place from which we've risen. So being in that, being as we actually are, that is karma and bhakti, that is yoga and jnana. Is what Bhagavan, so this verse 10 is summarizing everything. So ultimately, all these paths are leading to the state of just being. Then in the next 5 verses, he talks about the path of yoga, and he shows how that leads to the to this path of vichara. First, in verse 11 and 12, he says, he explains why when one restrains the breath, the mind is also restrained, like a bird caught in a net. This is a means to restrain the mind, and he explains why, because the mind and the breath are like 2 branches of a single tree. And they have the respective functions of knowing and doing, but their root is one. So that's why if you control one, you control the other. So by controlling the breath, that's a means to subdue the activity of mind. But then in verse 13, he says that the dissolution of mind, that's what he says in Tamil is, ilayamum nasum irendam mam oduka odukum ilayatu ilayatulladu erum undipara eradu urumaindadel undipara. What that means is dissolution. That means dissolution of mind is of two kinds, laya and nasa. What is lying down or dissolved in laya will rise. If its form dies, it will not rise. So in yoga, they're trying to control the mental activity. That is, by controlling the breath, they control the mental activity. They subdue the mental activity. But if we take that too far, we end up in manolaya. But our aim is not manolaya, because manolaya is only temporary. Our aim is manonasa. So how to attain manonasa? He explains in verse 14. What he says in verse 14, only odaka valiye odungum ulate vidakave o vari undipara vium adanuru undipara. That means only when one sends the mind, which will become calm when one restrains the breath, on the investigating path, will its form perish. That is what the word he uses for investigating path is or vari. Or is a word that has two meanings in this context. We can take it as one path. We can take it also as orum vari, the investigating path. So the one path by which the mind will die is the path of self-investigation. So Bhagavan is referring here to a path of self-investigation. So Bhagavan often used to say, if people wanted to do pranayama, he would say, fine, if you find it beneficial to do pranayama, fine, but don't let it go to the extent where you subside in laya, because that's of no benefit. Before the mind subsides in laya, once you've achieved a certain degree of calmness of mind, then you should use that calmness of mind by turning your attention back within to see who am I. That looking within to see who am I is the investigating path that he refers to here. And he says, vidakave ovari, only when one sends the mind on the investigating path will its form die. So again, he's showing how yoga, ultimately, the ultimate aim of yoga can be achieved only by turning to this path of self-investigation. Sorry, I misestimated the time. I've got only a few minutes left. So I tried to cover too much ground. What I wanted to conclude by saying is, when Bhagavan talks about the oneness of Bhakti and Jnana, he's not just talking about it. That is his actual experience, and we can see that most clearly in all the 5 hymns, or all of Arunachala Stuti Panchakam, but most especially in Arunachala Aksharamalai. That is the song of supreme love. That is the purest of pure bhakti we can find in Aksharamalai. That is, Bhagavan sang Aksharamalai in the what is sometimes called the Nayaka Bhava. That is the bhava of the bride and the bridegroom. That is the bride, the jiva. God is the bridegroom. The jiva is the bride. In the bhakti traditions of other parts of Vedanta, among the Vishistadvaitins and the Dvaitins and the Gaudiya Sampradaya and other the more bhakti traditions of Vedanta, I think they call it Matara Bhava. This Nayaka Bhava. It's considered the highest and purest form of love. That is it's exemplified in the love of the gopis for Krishna. That is the love. The gopis took themselves to be the brides of Krishna. Of course, it isn't to be taken as literally true. It's not about the carnal love. The carnal love is used as a metaphor for the true, deep inner love, the love of the soul for God, the love of the jiva for God. This is exemplified throughout. This bhava is so strong throughout Aksharamala. It's a heart-melting song. But at the same time, if we study Aksharamala deeply, it's got very deep Advaitic import. That is what Bhagavan is praying for. From the very first verse, he's talking about annihilation of ego. When ego is annihilated, everything is annihilated. Then then what remains is only Arunachala. And Arunachala, of course, is our own real nature. As Bhagavan says in, for example, in Arunachala Pancharatnam, in the second verse of Arunachala Pancharatnam, Bhagavan says in Sanskrit, Pridi Atma Iti Atmataya Nrityasi. As oneself you dance in the heart as I. And in Tamil he says, Nityamum, always, Nad Endru, as I, idiom, Naditidu Vayal. Since you always dance in the heart as I, they say your name is heart itself. So Arunachala is Atman, it's our own real nature, it is Atma Swarupa. It is so what Bhagavan is praying for in the heart-melting language of devotion. And I don't think any serious bhakta can read Aksharamla and not be melted by it. It is such a heart-melting prayer, but it's all a prayer for the Advaita Anubhava, that is the very second verse of Aksharamla. Bhagavan prays, Arahu Sundaram Bol Ahamum Niyum Travinama Irupom Arunachala. Like Arahu and Sundaram. Arahu is a Tamil word that means beauty, and Sundaram is a Sanskrit word that means beauty. So both the forms are different, they are one in meaning. And Arahu is also the name of Bhagavan's mother, and Sundaram is the name of his father. So Bhagavan is talking about also alluding to the harmony and oneness of their marriage. But the primary meaning, he's talking about the words Arahu and Sundaram, which have the same meaning. Like Arahu and Sundaram, may you and I, we can split it in two ways. We can take it either as utru, which means becoming one, or we can take it as uniting. Utru can mean uniting, or we can take it as mutru, which means completely. So may you and I be completely non-different. That's one meaning. Another meaning is Bhagavan is saying you and I are non-different. We can take it another way. Either Bhagavan is reminding us there in the very second verse that he and Arunachala are one. If we take it as a statement, if we take it as a prayer, it's a prayer for that oneness, so that state of complete non-difference. Abhinam means without any difference, and Mutru Abhinam means completely without any difference. So this is what Bhagavan is praying for in Aksharamla. So he's praying for the Advaita Anubhava, but he's praying in a language of bhakti. So Bhagavan is the fullness of both bhakti and jnana. I'm sorry I couldn't say more, but this is, I had so much more to say, but when we start talking about Bhagavan, there's no end to it. Bhagavan he is the flower of Vedanta. He's the flower of all human spiritual endeavor. He is the source and the goal of all of us. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Arunachala Ramanaya.